Meeting been a discussion centered on whether we should have an under tank or over the axle tank. Excuse me, under floor tank, I'm sorry.
That was the project I was working on.
Okay, and that you were working on that project with Mr. Ridenauer and Mr. Muddy and Mr. Diner, correct?
Basically, I was working on the project with Mr. Ridenauer and Mr. Muddy. Mr. Diener provided design resources to do studies.
And in working on that project with Mr. Ridenauer and Mr. Muddy, you in fact went out and studied crashed vehicles to determine how their fuel systems performed, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
And again, this is just, and the reason you were doing that is you were trying to determine whether General Motors should go to the over-the-tank axle design for its fuel tanks in one of its 1977 model cars, correct?
Object the form of the question.
Back
Over the tank axle.
well, I just describe what we were doing.
Oh, did I say that backwards? I'm sorry. The over-the-axle tank.
The 77B car was the next major vehicle that we were designing, and Oldsmobile was responsible for the fuel system. And so there was questions about where we should put the fuel tank, and this project was conceived to answer that question.
So the project you were working on with Mr. Ridenauer and Mr. Muddy was to determine whether GM should go to the over-the-axle tank design in one of its 1977 vehicles, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And in doing that, is it true that you and Mr. Muddy and Mr. Ridenauer went to Eaton Rapids Auto Salvage Yard and inspected damaged vehicles to assess how their respective fuel systems performed?
Yes, we did that.
And in doing that, did you come to the conclusion that in a major accident you would see the under the floor, which by the way, the 1991 Pontiac Sunbird has an under the floor fuel tank, doesn't it?
Objection.
This, I would have to say that there's a totally different fuel system in the Sunbird than what we were considering back then because of its location. It's in an entirely different location than either one that were being considered back in 1973. It is under the floor,
correct,
but that's the only thing you could say about it. It wouldn't relate to this study that we did at all.
The difference is that in the Sunbird, the tank is under the floor and forward of the rear axle. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in the cars back in 1973 that had under the floor tank designs, the fuel tank was rear of the rear axle. Is that fair?
Yes, we had rear. They were mostly rear drive with a rear axle and a prop shaft, and so you couldn't put the fuel tank ahead of the axle.
But you agree with me that both the rear of the axle design that you're discussing in Exhibit 6 and the forward or midship fuel tank design, which is forward of the rear axle, are under the floor of the vehicle?
Object the form of the question.
You can answer.
Yes, they are.
Okay. But I understand you're saying you're comparing under the floor rear of the axle versus over the axle position.
Yes,
Is that fair?
that's what this study was
Okay.
doing. There's a totally different system in the Sunbird.
And you went out and you looked at crashed vehicles in trying to determine which system was best.
Yes.
Okay. And you came up with the conclusion that in major accidents that the under the floor tank would deform but survived the accident, yet the over-the-axle tank had very slight damage. Is that fair?
Well, these are not conclusions. These are categories that we derived and used to evaluate the vehicles that we found that had rear damage.
Okay. You categorize them by severity of the accident. Is
Yes.
that fair? Then in the third category, a severe accident, you found that the under-the-floor tank would be broken. And by the way, when you say broken, does that mean punctured?
Well, that means that the fuel tank was violated in some way.
Leaked.
Yes.
Okay. But you found that the over-the-axle tank deformed but survived the accident, correct?
Well, finding or not, we didn't see very many over-the-axle tanks in our study. They were very few. So you have to understand how we did the study. These are strictly categories. It's not necessarily what we found.
Well, in the...
Excuse me, let me finish.
Are you finished, Mr. Ryan?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. In the severe category, you and Mr. Muddy and Mr. Ridenauer found that an under-the-floor tank would actually leak, yet the over-the-axle tank would not. Is that a fair statement?
That was the way we estimated it.
That's the way you estimated.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, Mr. Muddy ended up doing an entire study based on this Eaton Rapids investigation of 1,100 vehicles, didn't he? You're aware of that, aren't you?
No.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. Would you agree with Mr. Muddy if he said that in a 30-mile-an-hour impact that is not a wipeout, that the over-the-tank axle performs better than the over-the-axle tank performs better than the under-the-floor tank?
Objection.
I-
Excuse me, the term underfloor is vague. It assumes facts not in the record. I object to the form of the question.
Well, you were also misspeaking about the axle in the tank and the way you said that, but
Let me rephrase the question. I withdraw it.
Right.
Would you agree with Mr. Muddy, based on his observations at Eaton Rapids, that in a 30-mile-an-hour or greater impact that is not a wipeout, the over-the-tank, the over-the-axle tank, and just for the people, when we say over-the-axle tank, that means it's up behind the back seat and between the trunk, right?
Yes.
That's what an over-the-axle tank is. So
Yes.
if I misspeak from now on, that's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Would you agree with Mr. Muddy that the over-the-axle tank, the one between the back seat and the trunk, performs better than an under-the-floor tank?
I have to tell you, I don't
Oh, excuse me, let me
know
object
what
to the form of
Mr.
the question. Vague, and I think it misstates Mr. Muddy's testimony.
I've never heard of Mr. Muddy making statements like that. And I'm not aware of him doing any other studies beyond the salvage yard studies that we do. So I don't know that I would agree with that. It depends on the categories and the state of the art and how you design the fuel tank.
Well, I've marked as Exhibit 7 Mr. Muddy's presentation on this subject at General Motors. And I want to direct your attention to 7, and I've submarked it, I'll make it 7A, to Mr. Muddy's statement that after reviewing approximately 1,100 accident vehicles and holding lots at Eaton Rapids and Trenton, Michigan, it is apparent that in accidents above 30, referencing miles per hour, but not complete wipeouts, the over-axle location provided more protection. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I was with Mr. Muddy. I just make note of the fact I was with Mr. Muddy when he went to those salvage yards. So
And is that what y'all found? When you put the tank up behind the back seat and the trunk, that you get more protection in a 30-mile-an-hour impact than you do by putting the tank under the floor? That's the question.
Object to the question, Spade.
I don't know that I don't remember that as being one of our conclusions.
Okay, well, let me show you the statement again, and I'm going to ask you if you agree or disagree with it.
I object to the document. I've never seen it before. It has not been authenticated, and there's no indication except a handwritten note that those are Paul Muddy's comments, so I have an objection to that. Go ahead.
Do you agree with the statement in this document, Exhibit 7, at Exhibit 7A, that says, after reviewing approximately, and by the way, Eaton Rapids is where you went with Mr. Muddy to look at crashed vehicles, isn't it?
Yes, and also to Trenton.
And you went to Trenton
Yes.
with him too,
Yes,
so
we
y'all
did.
were looking at these vehicles.
Yes.
That his statement that after reviewing approximately 1,100 accident vehicles and holding lots at Eaton Rapids and Trenton, Michigan, it is apparent that the accidents above 30, and you take that to mean miles per hour, don't you?
Yes.
But not complete, quote, wipeouts, unquote, the over axle location provided more protection.
I don't think I would agree with that.
Don't agree with Mr. Muddy on that.
I don't
Okay.
know that Mr. Muddy said that, and I have to tell you this, that when we were in those junkyards, there was no way you could tell we had no data on the closing speeds of any of those accidents or anything like that. We looked at the cars, and we looked at what they looked like being crushed.
Well, let me ask you this. In the document that your name is on here, Exhibit
6.
6, you state that based on your and Mr. Muddy and Mr. Ridenour's look at the Eaton Rapids salvage yard, that in a severe accident, the under-the-floor tank was broken, leaked. The over-the-axle tank deformed, but survived the accident, did not leak. Is that correct?
Objections, repetitious.
You can answer.
That is one of our categories.
And that was the
And
result
we
of
used
your
that.
investigation,
And
wasn't it?
no, these were not the results. These are categories that we used after looking at the cars and we took Polaroid pictures of all the cars. We devised these categories to rank the accidents that we saw.
Right.
All right, and I'm just saying that was one of the categories, and that there were cars that would exhibit this characteristic. And you have to understand also how we did the study. I can explain that if you want it.
No, sir. Let me just ask you this. Did you write in this document, based on your discussions with Mr. Ridenour and Muddy, that in a number 3 category, severe accident, do you state under the floor tank broken, over the axle tank deformed but survived the accident?
That's what's written.
Yes, sir. Now, I also want to direct your attention to the number 2 category. And by the way, you start with the discussions that you and Mr. Ridenour and Mr. Muddy are having, then you get, and you number them 1 through 12, is that correct?
Yes.
Then you get to a category called the following actions are to be taken, is that correct?
Yes.
And your
Objection, misreading it.
the following actions are to be taken, that's
Oh,
what
well,
it
it
says.
says are being taken.
Oh, excuse me. Okay. The following actions are being taken, is that correct?
Yes.
And you list 4 different categories of actions that you and Mr. Muddy and Mr. Ridenour still are going out to do after this meeting, is that right?
Yes.
And that meeting, again, was 3 weeks prior to you writing your value analysis, wasn't it?
Yes.
And one of the things that y'all still had to do is number 2, Mr. Ridenour will obtain summaries of legal actions against the corporation having to do with fire in A, B, C, and E cars exclusive of wagons. Is that correct?
Yes.
So one of the things, based on this meeting, 3 weeks before you wrote your value analysis, that you set out for Mr. Ridenour to do was to go study the pending lawsuits against GM concerning fuel-fed fires, correct?
Yes.
Did he go do that study?
No, he did not.
He did not. You're sure of that sitting here today?
Yes,
And why is that?
because I did that.
You studied it. So
Yes.
you went and looked. And you went over to engineering analysis, didn't you?
Yes.
And that's the folks that look at lawsuits at GM, isn't it?
They
testify.
don't,
Go ahead.
I don't know exactly what they do, but they had the documents.
They had the lawsuits, didn't they?
They had, what they had was the documents of the physical evidence of the accidents.
Okay.
Pictures and accident reports.
So
things like that.
3 weeks before you wrote your value analysis, you went over to engineering analysis and you reviewed and studied the pending lawsuits against General Motors dealing with fuel-fed fires, didn't you?
For those that were related to cars, yes.
Automobiles, correct. Then one of the other things that, did you look at the settlement value of some of those cases?
These, no, I did not. What I did is I looked at all the documents that related to the accident itself to see if it would tell us anything about the fuel tank location. Because it was strictly an engineering analysis that I did. And the cases weren't settled, they were pending. So these were, and I have no idea whatever happened to any of those cases.
Of course, at that time, General Motors did not have any fuel tanks that they placed over the axle behind the back seat in the trunk, did they?
I don't recall any.
And as of this date, today, you only have one car where you place the tank above the axle between the back seat and the trunk. Is that correct?
The only one that has a location close to that, as best I can recall, is the F car.
The F car is the Firebird and the Camaro,
Yes,
and it's only partially above the axle, correct?
yes.
But isn't the Corvette tank above the axle?
No, it's behind the axle.
Okay. So,
And that's the old model. The new model has two tanks, and I don't think they're over the axle. I think they're beside and behind the axle.
okay, but regardless, at the time you went to study the lawsuits, 3 weeks before you wrote your value analysis, there really were no tanks that General Motors was placing between the back seat and the trunk, were there?
I'm not aware of any.
And what you and Mr. Ridenour and Mr. Muddy were doing were trying to determine whether General Motors should put those tanks behind the back seat and between the trunk, weren't you?
Yes,
And General Motors didn't do that, not to this day, did they?
and our recommendation didn't recommend doing that.
Now, you also put down here that you wanted in the fourth category of the following actions are being taken. You put that you, Mr. Muddy, will re-examine and provide a breakdown of the last cost study of the over-the-axle tank, didn't you?
That's what's written, yes.
Okay, and that was something that Mr. Muddy was to do just 3 weeks prior to you writing your value analysis, wasn't it?
Well, in any trade-off study that you do, then that's part of what you do.
Let me show you what I've marked as Exhibit 8 and ask you if in fact General Motors did determine how much it would cost to place the tank over the axle, again between the back seat and the trunk, in their 1973 A car. Just direct your attention to the 2 tabbed pages there.
You have an extra copy for me so we can read them at the same time?
I don't believe I've
Well,
ever
that's the
seen
one
it.
I didn't,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I don't believe I've ever seen this document.
This is dated January 71. Counsel, I'm going to object to this. You've taken Bates numbers and just staple them together. Obviously, not the same document. So I have no idea what you're doing here.
Okay. Let me ask you two things. First, I want to direct your attention to Plaintiff's Exhibit 8, or to Exhibit 8. But let me ask you this. Why is it that it was important to you to know 3 weeks before you wrote your value analysis how much it would cost GM to place the tank over the axle between the back seat and the trunk?
Objection, it restates, it misstates his last testimony. That's an improper
Well, I would,
question.
I'd just say that we were working on a project on fuel tank location. A cost study of the design alternatives is one of those things that you do when you do that kind of study. I don't think it has anything to do, and there's no connection between these activities and my value analysis, as far as I can tell. It's not called out as even something that we should be doing if these are the actions to be taken. So I don't think there's any relationship whatsoever in your conjecture.
Well, there's certainly actions that you were working on in the time period 3 weeks prior to writing your value analysis, weren't they?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, let me ask you this. I want to direct your attention to the tabbed pages in
Counsel.
Exhibit 8.
Counsel, I must insist that you give a separate number to this second document because it's clearly not a single document, and it's misleading.
You getting this time?
What do you mean getting this time? You have an improper document. It's just like when you screwed up the videotape earlier. That's not our time, that's your time.
Whoa,
You
wait a
get
minute,
the-
wait a
you get
minute.
the
Are
document
we
straight.
getting a little personal here? I don't think that's very professional.
No, it's nothing personal.
Well, certainly you're
Okay?
raising your voice. Let's just proceed with this deposition.
Go ahead. I mean, I'm only asking something simple, that you,
You want me to mark them separately?
obviously they're not the same document.
Well, I don't agree with that, but here, we'll mark, you want to start at 10105, and we'll mark that as, document 8A. Now, I want to direct your attention to the tabbed page there. And it says, it's discussing the cost of putting the tank over the axle between the rear seat and the trunk in the 1973 A car. Does that document reflect that a cost comparison using the 1971 A car as base shows that with an over-axle tank and semi-sealed evaporative control system, a $10.99 cost penalty exists? Again, the canister system is a cost plus of $8.59. Is that what that document states?
I
Just if you want to read it, you can read it, but don't ask him to do anything other than that.
That's what it says. I
Yes.
have no idea of the context. It's a cost study. That's
Well,
numbers.
Does that indicate to you that back in 1971, that GM determined that the additional cost to them for placing the tank over the axle between the rear seat and the trunk would have been at least $8.59.
No, I have no idea of the numbers. I'd have to look at more of the numbers. I'm sure it cost money to make almost any change. If this could be a good number or not, I don't know. I have no way of telling, but that's what's stated. And you talked about the canister. I think the canister is a separate cost, different than the over-the-axle tank design.
Well, let me direct your attention to the next tab page. And does it go on to state that using the same comparison, the cost penalties would be $13.99 and $11.59 respectively?
Objection, that's totally out of context.
Well, that's what it says. Yeah.
Okay. And does that indicate to you that GM determined it would cost them at least $11.59 a car to put the axle between the back seat and the trunk on the 1973A car?
If you're going to ask him to come to conclusions, then you have to give him time to read it. If you want to use your time to let him read it, that's fine.
Well, I guess I don't agree with that because it make note of the fact, like the previous one, it says the canister is a cost plus of $11.59. So
That's the canister system,
right.
which was the system being used. That's the number without adding the semi-sealed evaporative control system.
I can't tell that by the context. I wouldn't read it that way.
Well, did you get any data from Mr. Muddy concerning the most recent breakdown of the cost study of an over-the-axle tank?
I don't recall seeing any data from Mr. Muddy.
You would agree with me, wouldn't you, that even back in 1973, it would have cost General Motors more than $2.20 a car to move the gas tank position between the rear seat and the trunk?
Objection, form of the question.
I have to say I have no idea what it cost. It probably cost more, but I don't know what it was back then. I'm sure there was a proper cost study done. I have no idea what those numbers were.
You would expect them to be more than $2.20 just from your general engineering knowledge, wouldn't you?
I'd have to say I can't say now what I would have thought back then or what it could be even today if you made a change like that. Depends on how you do the design.
How much time do we have?
None.
It's 1 hour, 30 minutes, 45 seconds on the actual.
Okay. I want to ask for a few more minutes because of the objections.
I'll give you time.
Okay. Now, Mr. Ivey, let's look at your value analysis and let me ask you. You distributed that analysis to Mr. Muddy, Mr. Bonner, Mr. Ball, Mr. Perkins, Mr. Wallace, and possibly Mr. Ridenour at General Motors, didn't you?
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
Do you not recall that, or are you telling me that that is not true? Those are two different things.
I have to say that, one, I don't remember sending it to anyone, and I don't believe that I did. And I don't believe that I did because it isn't written in the form of a letter or a document to send to someone. And the key reason I don't believe that I sent it to anyone is because no one ever came and asked me about it. There are incorrect conclusions in this document, and you know, I believe that if anyone had seen it, they would have asked me to correct it.
You were asked by Oldsmobile management to do your value analysis, were you not?
I have no recollection of anyone asking me to do this.
So you're not telling me that Oldsmobile management did not ask you to do the value analysis? You're telling me you don't recall if anyone asked you to do it.
I'd have to say I don't think anyone asked me to do it. I don't remember anyone asked me to do it, but I can't categorically say no one asked me to do it.
The purpose stated by you for your value analysis was to try to figure out how much Oldsmobile could spend on fuel systems, was it not?
I have no idea of my purpose of writing this document.
Again, would that be you just don't recall, or are you telling me that the statement that you were trying to figure out how much Olds could spend on fuel systems is incorrect?
Like I said, I wouldn't agree with that statement.
That's an additional 3.
Do you not recall the purpose being to try to find out how much Olds could spend on fuel systems, or are you telling me that that is an incorrect statement?
I can only tell you that I don't know why I wrote this document. And I couldn't say any more than that. I don't remember why I wrote it, and that's, if that answers the question.
One more question. Can I ask him? Mr. Ron Elwell assisted you in obtaining the information that you used to write your value analysis, correct?
Hold on, let me get some light here. I think this was... Okay, go ahead.
I have absolutely no recollection of ever meeting Mr. Elwell or him helping me with this.
All right, thank you.
Now, for the record, we would like to request an additional hour to question Mr. Ivey, because due to the nature of the case, due to the nature of the documents, due to the fact that we are here deposing him about his value analysis, as well as deposing him because he was the manager of the J-car at issue in this case, manager of J-car engineering, we have not been able to get to all of the material that is relevant for this deposition. And we're asking you to confer with counsel, Mr. Ivey, and allow us to question you for an additional hour.
He doesn't need to confer with counsel. The request is denied. Mr. Ivey.
Let me make a statement for the record.
Sir, I've got a plane to catch.
Well, I have to make a statement for the record. We are not agreeing to adjourn this deposition, but will petition the court to continue the deposition on another date of Mr. Ivey, based on the fact that we tried very hard to get through everything we could in a concise manner, but we feel now that the issue is ripe. Dan and I discussed this. He said, you know, it's not a ripe issue. We're not going to agree to go beyond an hour and a half. We flew up here at our expense. We've gotten the hotel. We've done everything at our expense. We tried very hard to get through all of the material relevant to this case that we need Mr. Ivey to testify about, but we were unable to do that. We did not even get into the area of his management of the J-car and the different designs on the J-car in any depth. And just for the record, there are two exhibits that are very,
Put this in your motion.
very
You're
relevant.
wasting time. You're
I'm
wasting
almost
time,
finished,
counsel.
bud.
Please,
There are
counsel.
two-
You're pushing me because you want me to miss my plane.
There are two exhibits that have been introduced in the prior two depositions while we're up here that are very relevant to this case, and they are the peg hanger that we say punctured the tank, and the design of that peg hanger, and then the trapeze portion of the hanger itself, which we needed Mr. Ivey to testify about as manager of J-car engineering, but were not able to get to ask him questions about because of the hour-and-a-half time limit. Now, with that understanding that we're not agreeing to adjourn, but are going to petition the court to come back, you now want to cross Mr. Ivey.
Counsel, I'm going to tell you that you wasted your time talking about 1971 documents, 1973 documents, behind the axle fuel tanks, and just wasted the time. And if you had asked him, and which I will bring out, Mr. Ivey had absolutely nothing to do with these two items before you. When he took over the management of JCAR, that was something already in progress, and it was completed by those in progress and never came under his control at any time. Thank you, sir. Excuse me.
Just a moment.
Mr. Ivey,
Well,
excuse
go
me.
ahead.
Counsel.
I think procedurally, we must do something. We are requesting the additional time. It is in your court. You need to tell us you will not allow the additional time, or you will allow the additional time.
How many times do you want me to tell you, John?
I haven't heard, if you can just tell me you will or will not allow the additional
John,
time.
I said I do not need to confer with him. The answer is no.
Okay, then then I think the issue is closed. Go ahead.
Mr. Ivey, what do you do for General Motors today?
I'm the director of the small car group chassis engineering.
And small car group chassis engineering, what does that mean?
That means that I'm responsible for the engineering of all the various chassis systems for the vehicles that we're responsible for in the corporation, which are the compact and small cars.
You build cars? I mean, that's your job?
No, I don't build cars.
What is your job? I mean, you design the cars, or are in charge of the designers that do the building?
I'm in charge of the engineers that release the chassis components and
Okay.
systems.
In the course of an average day, how many emails and letters, and reports, and documents do you receive?
I would say I get anywhere from 50 to 100 every day.
And that's been for several years?
Oh, for a long time, ever since I've been in the management ranks.
And you don't do hands-on engineering much anymore, do you?
No, I do not.
We're talking about a document here, the value analysis that was written how many years ago?
Over 25 years ago.
And have these 50 to 100 pieces of paper for some period of time, has that been passing over your desk for a good part of that 25 years?
Yes.
And when you wrote this document, how long had you been working for General Motors? I mean, full-time.
Full-time, about 3 years.
When did you go to work first full-time for General Motors?
In 1970, I started work in the engineering laboratory.
What month?
I think it was August.
So, come August of 70, you went in the lab and did what?
I ran testing. We would get work orders that would come from the engineers, test engineers, and we would run physical tests basically on components using the hardware that's there. Sometimes we would design the test equipment to run the test.
It's basically a training program.
Yes, back then almost all of the engineers started in the lab.
And then what was your second job?
I went into a group that was called Product Quality. I don't know if that's the exact name, but it was a sort of a paperwork job that had to do with approving new designs, dealing with the you dealt with the dimensions of the parts. New parts would come in, and our inspection people would go over them with all the dimensional fine-tooth comb, and then I would approve the use of those parts in full production.
You're measuring parts.
Right.
And then what was your third job?
I became a test engineer. I was responsible for rear axles and prop shafts in test engineering.
And so you left that, and what was your fourth job at General Motors?
I went into advanced design.
So when you went into advanced design, you completed 2 years.
Yes.
And the job at Advanced Design was just doing projects, sort of?
Yes, it was individual projects, and they of all different nature. They were all related to future model cars, that kind of projects.
And do you remember all those projects?
No, I remember a few, but not all of them.
How many do you think you did?
Oh, I would say probably anywhere from 10 to 20 projects over the year I was there.
Okay. Where are you from?
I'm from Arkansas, originally.
How'd you get to General Motors? Just briefly.
I was, well, I was in the 4-H back then, because I lived out in the country, and I became a safety winner for the State Safety Award, and because of that I got to go to the National Congress, and General Motors sponsored the safety winners, and so at that time I was a senior in high school, and I met some public relation people from General Motors and told them that I liked cars and wanted to be an engineer, and one of the PR people suggested that I go to what he called GM Tech, which I'd never heard of at the time, and when I got back home I investigated, and that was General Motors Institute, and I applied and ended up going to GMI and being sponsored by Oldsmobile.
Okay. When we talk about this value analysis, and that $200,000 figure that you say you wrote it something wrong, what do you mean by that?
Well, the $200,000 I use is a government figure, and the government figure of $200,000 is a societal harm figure, and that relates to when they do regulations. They do analysis of situations and fatalities that can relate to that, and then they use that to judge how to write their regulations to maximize the benefit to society by reducing the fatalities, and so they use numbers to do that.
Wait a minute. The 200,000 came from the government?
Yes, it was a government number.
And they said the 200,000 is a loss to society when someone dies?
Yes.
Was this like a standard number used back in the 70s?
Well, I have no idea, but they still use a societal loss number even today. The government does. I don't know what it is today, but there is still a number being used, and that is whether I understood it or not. You know, that's the main thing that's wrong with this document. And, I use that $200,000 as a cost to General Motors, and you know, it isn't a cost to General Motors.
It's a cost to who?
It's a cost to society.
So society loses
Right.
200,000 when someone dies.
That's what the government thinks, you know, in their calculations.
But what did you say about the value of a human life in this document?
Well, I stated, you know, in the last paragraph that I don't think you can put a value on human life. And I agree with that today.
All right, is that 200,000 the same figure that we saw in the document that the plaintiff gave you that was prepared by Mr. Fisher, that's Exhibit 4?
Well, I don't know that it is, but I guess in the date and that goes with the same time I used, I'd have to say that it most likely is the same number.
All right. Well, in this thing it says we could spend $2 per car effectively for rear impact protection. That would be the $2 that society could spend. Is that possible?
You could conclude that.
Well, let's read the next one. It says, this would be used up in fuel for the additional weight required. Well, who's paying for fuel? Is General Motors paying for fuel?
No.
Who's paying for fuel?
The customer would be paying for fuel.
Society. So the person that may save something because of a car having an improvement, they're going to spend that in additional weight.
In what they were talking about here, this 301 stuff, yes.
When you took over as manager of J Engineering in April of 1990, what was your job? What did you do?
Well, in April of 1990, when that happened, we reorganized. Where before,
The whole company reorganized?
Well, no, the small car group engineering reorganized because we were adding a whole other set of engineers from another part of the company, and we were integrating them, so we reorganized. And where before, there hadn't been a manager of J Engineering. And we created what we call the platform managers, and I was one of those. I ended up with the J car. Other people ended up with the N car and the L car, which were other vehicles that we did. So we were, in essence, creating the job while we got it. So there were no, how should I put it, there were no a previous person who had the job and I was just doing the same thing. There were, we, at the time that happened, we were creating the job, and the main thing I spent my time on in the year that I had the job was the design of the 95J, which was a brand new model which had an all-new design.
What happened to projects that were ongoing at that time?
Well, today, those projects would have been handled by the manager of the engineering and change committees. But back then, we didn't have any of that organized. So those were handled by the functional organizations. So it was done the old way.
So you had nothing to do whatsoever with the design of the peg hanger for the 1991 J car?
No, I wouldn't have.
And you had nothing to do with the exhaust system or the fuel system for the 91 J car?
No, it would have been approved. Whatever would have happened then would have been approved and done by the other functional engineering group along with the planning group.
Did any of the exhaust system people working on the project for the peg hanger for the 91 J car report to you?
No, they did not.
That's all I have. Go ahead.
Is the word society or societal contained anywhere in the value analysis that you did?
No, it is not, and that's a mistake.
Is the word society or societal contained anywhere in the cost-benefit analysis that Mr. Fisher did less than a year later?
Objection to the characterization as cost-benefit analysis.
That's true. It doesn't say cost-benefit analysis, but it referenced cost-benefit here.
It does
about
say
that.
cost-benefit.
It says cost-benefit,
Yes,
but
sir.
it doesn't say anything about societal, anything in this document.
The word society or societal is not anywhere included in either of those mathematical calculations or analyses.
I can't say anything about Mr. Fisher's document, only having seen it today. But I know mine, it is not contained, but that's the major mistake in these calculations. That's why the conclusions are incorrect.
So the word society or societal is not in your value analysis, correct?
That's correct.
And the word society or societal or any reference there too is not in Mr. Fisher's cost-benefit calculation, is it?
It isn't noted, but he
I'm
referenced.
object. That's 3 times you've asked that question, and it's repetitious, and you're just wasting your time.
You can answer.
Well, it isn't referenced, but there's several reports and presentations referenced, and societal stuff might have been referenced in those references that he has here. So
But it's not written in the report, is it?
No, it is not.
And, Mr. Ivey, your job in 1990 and 91 was to manage J-Car Engineering, is that correct?
Yes.
And you understand that a 1991 Pontiac Sunbird burned up with my client's children inside. That's what we're here about.
Objection.
I
Is
understand.
that or not?
I hadn't had that information until you told me.
You understand that this case is about a 1991 Pontiac Sunbird.
Yes.
And that was manufactured and sold during the time that you, Mr. Ed Ivey, were the manager of J-Car Engineering, correct?
I guess I would have to look when it was manufactured. I was that manager for a year, so I couldn't say that it was manufactured while I was the manager. It depends on when it was built.
And one last question. If you followed the job responsibility laid out for you in 1973, you would have reported this value analysis to Mr. Wallace, wouldn't you?
Objection, he's already answered that. It was not a method.
It depends on whether it was an assigned project. If I did it on my own, I might not have reported to Mr. Wallace.
Might not. Do you recall sitting here today that you absolutely did not report your value analysis
Objection.
to Mr. Wallace, your supervisor?
Asked and answered.
You can answer.
I have no recollection of sending it to anyone, and I don't believe that I did.
Okay, you said that was the last question.
We
We're off.
reserve the right. We're not,
Deposition is terminated.
we're not adjourning. We reserve the right to continue this deposition after petitioning the court for more time because we did not get to go into the design of the J-Car that was manufactured while Mr. Ivey was the manager of J-Car Engineering.
Nothing to do with it. We brought it up.
Off the record, 10:35 a.m.